On a frozen morning in January 1945, the Vosges Mountains became a graveyard of white and red. Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham stood at the base of Hill 616, watching his platoon wither away. German machine gun fire ripped through the winter sky, pinning the American soldiers into the deep snow. At 24 years old, Dunham decided that today was not the day his story would end. 3 MG-42 machine guns were nestled in timber bunkers high above on the steep, icy slope. Each weapon was a mechanical demon, spitting out 1,200 rounds of lead every single minute. The American soldiers of Company I were trapped in a killing box with no room to breathe or move. Artillery shells began to bracket their position, signaling that total annihilation was only moments away. The slope was a brutal 40-degree incline covered in 18 inches of fresh, treacherous powder. 11 men from the 2nd Platoon had already been lost to the mountain's cold embrace that week. The snow around the pinned unit was churned into a dark, sickening crimson by the relentless fire. Every man knew the statistics. The 3rd Infantry Division was losing more lives than any other unit. The Germans held every advantage, including the high ground and clear lines of sight across the valley. Retreat meant being cut down in the open, while staying still meant waiting for the artillery to find them. Dunham looked at his men pressed flat against the earth, paralyzed by the converging fields of fire. The temperature bit through their wool uniforms at 12 degrees, freezing the blood in their veins. Dunham crawled back to the company line and found a single white mattress cover in the supplies. He tore the fabric and draped it over his uniform like a makeshift robe of winter camouflage. Then he began a terrifying transformation, loading himself with every ounce of firepower he could find. He jammed 12 carbine magazines and a dozen fragmentation grenades into every pocket and loop. When he finally stood up, he was a walking arsenal carrying 72 pounds of lethal equipment. His platoon sergeant watched in silence as the white-clad figure prepared to face the mountain alone. Dunham didn't offer a speech or an explanation. He simply turned and began to crawl into the abyss. The first 75 yards were a slow, agonizing game of inches that took 18 minutes to cross. He moved only when the German fire shifted, pressing his face into the freezing slush to vanish. The heavy grenades dragged against his body, and his hands went numb as the snow soaked his robe. At the 75-yard mark, he was finally within striking distance of the first timber bunker. Inside, 3 German soldiers scanned 4 targets, unaware that death was crawling toward their door. Dunham rose from the white landscape like a ghost and charged directly at the first machine gun nest. The Germans spotted the movement and swung the heavy barrel of the MG4 toward the charging man. At 6 yards, the gun roared, and a rifle bullet tore a 10-inch gash across Dunham's muscular back. The impact spun him around and threw him 15 yards down the hill, staining the snow a bright red. He landed face down in the powder, the excruciating pain pulling at his spine with every ragged breath. A German egg grenade landed just 2 feet from his head, hissing as it prepared to end his life. With a surge of adrenaline, Dunham kicked the explosive away just before it detonated in a cloud of ice. Against all laws of physics and medicine, Russell Dunham stood back up and continued his assault. He came up the hill firing his M1 carbine, moving faster than the Germans could track his position. He ducked inside the machine gun's minimum traverse arc, rendering the heavy weapon completely useless. With a 3-round burst, he silenced the gunner and then moved to take down the assistant gunner. The 3rd crewman threw his hands up in terror as the bloody American ghost loomed over the bunker. His first magazine was empty, 30 rounds expended in a blur of violence and high-speed motion. Dunham grabbed the surviving German by his collar and hauled him out of the timber-reinforced hole. He shoved the prisoner down the slope toward the American lines, providing a gift for the intelligence teams. Blood was now pouring down Dunham's back, soaking his white mattress cover until he looked like a flag. The 2nd machine gun nest sat 50 yards uphill, its crew having watched the entire brutal encounter. They adjusted their fire, walking tracers across the slope to prevent the lone American from advancing. Dunham reloaded a fresh magazine, ignoring the pooling blood that was now warming his frozen uniform. He could see the dark shape of the second barrel tracking his movement through the swirling mountain fog. The Germans opened fire at 40 yards, kicking up geysers of snow that blinded the wounded sergeant. Dunham dropped to his knees, stopping every few yards to keep from blacking out from the intense pain. At 25 yards, he pulled 2 fragmentation grenades from his belt and yanked the safety pins. He hurled them in a high, perfect arc, watching them vanish into the dark slit of the second timber bunker. A scream echoed from inside the nest just before the twin explosions shattered the logs and earth. The machine gun went silent, and Dunham moved forward through the black smoke with his carbine raised. The entire 3-man crew lay dead among the wreckage of their position, destroyed by his precision. But he didn't stop to rest. His eyes were already locked on the supporting infantry in the nearby holes. 6 German riflemen scrambled to escape their foxholes as the bloody sergeant bore down on them. From 15 yards away, Dunham emptied another magazine, hitting 3 and sending the others fleeing. Let the survivors run up the ridge, focusing his remaining strength on the final, highest objective. The 3rd machine gun nest was 65 yards further up, holding the absolute peak of Hill 616. The Germans at the summit had been watching the one-man massacre for over 12 minutes. They knew he was wounded, and that his white camouflage was now a target-rich shade of deep crimson. Rifle grenades began to explode around him, the concussions knocking him sideways into the frozen dirt. Dunham was out in the open with no cover, leaving a trail of blood that looked like a red road in the snow. He crawled toward the final cluster of timber, his vision tunneling as blood loss began to take its toll. The 3rd position was reinforced with sandbags, giving it a commanding view of the entire southern valley. The snow was so cold it burned his skin, but he timed his movements between the guns' rhythmic bursts. With 8 grenades left and 9 magazines, he prepared for the final, desperate sprint to the top. At 15 yards, Dunham gathered his legs and lunged forward for the last time on that mountain. The Germans fired wildly, but Dunham was already tossing 2 more grenades into the narrow firing slit. The massive blast threw sandbags and splintered timber into the air, blowing the machine gun off its mount. He moved into the smoke to finish the job, ensuring the 3rd nest was well and truly silenced forever. Suddenly, the crunch of boots behind him signaled a German rifleman emerging from a hidden foxhole. A Mauser rifle fired at point-blank range, the bullet missing Dunham's head by only 3 small inches. Dunham spun and fired 2 rounds, hitting the enemy in the throat and chest before he could bolt. The sergeant stood alone on the hilltop, the silence of the mountain finally replacing the roar of battle. He had fired 175 rounds and thrown 11 grenades to win that peak. Below him, the men of Company I were finally moving up the slope, their path cleared by his hands. His brother Ralph was among them, witnessing the impossible victory his sibling had just achieved. Dunham sat down in the red-stained snow, his task complete and his strength finally beginning to fade. Medics reached him 8 minutes later, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric to reveal the carnage. The bullet had missed his spine by 2 inches, leaving a gash 10 inches long and 2 inches deep. They packed the wound with sulfa powder and morphine, but Dunham refused to be carried off the field. He walked back down the hill on his own 2 feet, carrying his empty carbine like a staff of war. By the time he reached the aid station that evening, he collapsed from the massive loss of blood. Surgeons used 43 stitches to close the wound, marveling that he wasn't paralyzed or dead. He was sent to a clearing station to recover, but the war was still hungry for experienced soldiers. The 3rd Infantry Division was operating at half strength, and every rifle was needed on the line. 10 days after his assault on Hill 616, Dunham walked back into the company post for duty. The stitches were still in, and his wound was still seeping, but he refused to let his men fight without him. They were moving north to the town of Holzwehr, where German armor was waiting in the heavy fog. Intelligence reported Tiger and Panther tanks, a nightmare scenario for an exhausted infantry unit. At dawn on January 22nd, 10 German tanks emerged from the mist like iron monsters. The Americans had no armor or heavy artillery to stop the advance of the legendary Tiger Eye units. Company 9 held a cluster of farm buildings, but their bazooka rockets simply bounced off the thick hulls. The commander, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, gave the order for the company to surrender. 147 men walked out with their hands up, but Russell Dunham was not among them. He slipped out the back of a farmhouse and ran toward a cluster of distant outbuildings for safety. His wound had reopened, the blood seeping through his bandages as he dodged the German patrols. He found a stone storage building with a wooden door and ducked inside to find a place to hide. Inside the building were several large wooden barrels, each standing about 4 feet tall. He checked the first two, finding only frozen potatoes and empty space, before opening the third. It was filled with sauerkraut, the fermented brine giving off a sharp, suffocatingly acidic odor. With the sound of German boots approaching the door, Dunham climbed into the slimy, cold mass. He sank up to his neck in the fermented cabbage and pulled the wooden lid over his head. The salt and acid of the brine hit his open back wound like a million stinging needles of fire. He bit his tongue to stay silent as the Germans entered and began kicking the barrels to check for men. They lifted the lids of the other containers, but luckily left the foul-smelling sauerkraut barrel alone. Dunham stayed in that frozen barrel for 13 agonizing hours as the sun set and the air turned bitter. The brine began to freeze into slush around his body, and his fingers turned white from the frostbite. Every movement caused fresh waves of acid to burn into his torn muscle and expose spinal tissue. At sunrise the next morning, he finally pushed the lid aside and climbed out of the fermented vat. His uniform was frozen stiff, and he smelled the vinegar, but he was alive and deep in enemy territory. He stepped outside to relieve himself against a wall, only to find 2 German soldiers staring at him. They raised their rifles and began shouting, catching the unarmed American in a moment of vulnerability. Dunham raised his hands, his carbine still lying at the bottom of the sauerkraut barrel behind him. The Germans searched him, but their attention was diverted by a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes. They began to argue over who owned the tobacco, ignoring the right side of Dunham's heavy field jacket. Hidden in a shoulder holster was his Colt 1911 pistol, unnoticed by the distracted German guards. They forced him into a vehicle and began driving toward their command post at a nearby chateau. Dunham sat in the back seat between his captors, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. When the driver left the car to enter the chateau, the guards finally lowered their guard for a second. Dunham pulled his Colt and shot both men before jumping from the car and sprinting for the woods. He ran through the frozen underbrush, bullets snapping past his head as the chateau erupted in chaos. He was now 30 miles behind enemy lines with no food, no map, and only 4 bullets left. His toes had turned black from frostbite, but he knew that stopping meant certain death in the cold. Moved west toward the sound of American artillery, using the booming howitzers as his only compass. For 3 days he avoided patrols and slept in hay, shivering so hard his teeth began to crack. On the 3rd day, he reached the Ill River and saw American engineers working on a bridge. He was wearing a captured German jacket to stay warm, and the engineers nearly shot him on sight. Dunham screamed his name and rank until they recognized his voice and waved him across the water. He collapsed on the far bank, his body finally broken by the journey, but his spirit still intact. He was rushed to a hospital where surgeons fought for 6 hours to save his blackened, frozen feet. While he recovered, news of his actions on Hill 616 reached the highest levels of the Allied command. They told him that he was being recommended for the nation's highest award for valor and bravery. Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham had been selected to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. In April 1945, Dunham stood in the ruins of Nuremberg as General Patch read his official citation. The general told him that he had never seen a single man turn the tide of a battle so completely. He had saved 120 lives through sheer refusal to stop, even when his blood ran cold. The medal was placed around his neck, a golden star for a man who had walked through hell in a mattress cover. Russell Dunham returned home to Illinois after the war, a quiet hero of the greatest generation. He worked for decades helping other veterans get their benefits, never bragging about his own silver stars. He carried the scars of Hill 616 and the shrapnel of the Vosges Mountains for the rest of his long life. He was a man who proved that one person, armed with enough courage, can change the entire world. The story of Hill 616 is a testament to the iron will of the American. Infantryman in World War II, Dunham's mattress cover assault became a legend among the men of the 3rd Infantry Division. It reminds us that history is often shaped by those who refuse to stay pinned down in the snow. His name is now etched in the archives of heroism, a permanent record of a sergeant who wouldn't die. We remember Russell Dunham not just for the lives he took, but for the 120 he saved. His bravery allowed fathers and sons to return home from a war that tried to swallow them whole. From the sauerkraut barrel to the podium in Nuremberg, his journey was one of absolute pure survival. Let his story be a light for those who find themselves trapped in the dark valleys of their own lives. Every generation produces a few souls who are capable of doing the impossible when the time comes. Dunham was a counselor, a husband, and a brother, but on one day in France, he was a force of nature. He passed away in 2009 at the age of 89, leaving behind a legacy that will never be forgotten. May we always honor the men who wore the white robes and carried the weight of a nation on their backs. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten archives of history, please leave a like and a comment. Your support helps us share the stories of real heroes like Russell Dunham with the entire world. Subscribe to stay tuned for more accounts of courage, survival, and the soldiers who changed history. Thank you for watching, and remember, true heroism is just a person doing their job against all odds. The M1 carbine Dunham used was a lightweight alternative to the heavier Grand rifle of the time. It allowed him to carry a massive amount of ammunition while still remaining mobile on the slope. Without the high capacity of the carbine, his solo assault might have ended in the very first nest. It was the perfect tool for a man who needed to move like a ghost and strike like a thunderbolt. The Mk2 fragmentation grenade was the secondary hero of the battle on that frozen French hillside. Its pineapple design allowed Dunham to secure them to his uniform using the buttons and loops. He used them as precision artillery, clearing out fortified bunkers that bullets alone could not reach. Each explosion was a message to the enemy that the Americans were no longer pinned in the valley. The Vosges Mountains campaign remains one of the most brutal and overlooked chapters of the war. The terrain was a nightmare of vertical climbs, thick forests, and sub-zero winter temperatures. Soldiers fought not just the German army, but the very earth and air around them every single day. Dunham's victory was a rare moment of brilliance in a campaign defined by slow, bloody attrition. The 3rd Infantry Division, known as the Rock of the Marne, earned more honors than any other. They saw combat in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy before the final push into the heart of Germany. Their casualty rates were staggering, yet they never wavered in their mission to liberate Europe. Dunham was the embodiment of their spirit, rugged, relentless, and completely dedicated to his brothers. The mattress cover camouflage was a stroke of genius born from the desperation of the front lines. Standard olive drab uniforms turned American soldiers into dark silhouettes against the white snow. By tearing up a simple bedding sheet, Dunham essentially invented a tactical advantage on the fly. It showed the ingenuity of the American GI, a soldier who could solve any problem with what was on hand. When the bullet carved through Dunham's back, it missed his vital spinal cord by the narrowest margin. Modern doctors often look at his medical records and wonder how he was able to stand, let alone fight. It was a miracle of anatomy and a testament to the massive amount of adrenaline in his system. He was a man running on pure willpower, ignoring the physical destruction of his own body to win. The German egg grenades he kicked away were a common weapon used by the Wehrmacht infantry. They were smaller and lighter than the potato masher stick grenades, making them easy to toss. Dunham's quick reflexes saved his life, as the concussion from such a close blast can be fatal. He didn't just survive the Germans. He survived the very explosives designed to tear him apart. Taking a prisoner in the middle of a solo assault is a rare feat of compassion and tactics. By sending the German gunner back to his lines, he provided vital information for the coming days. It also showed that even in his rage and pain, Dunham maintained the discipline of a professional. He was a soldier of the highest order, balancing the need to kill with the duty to capture. The sauerkraut barrel escape is one of the most unique survival stories in the history of the war. Fermented cabbage is highly acidic, making it a terrible environment for a man with a massive back wound. The brine likely acted as a primitive antiseptic, though it caused him a level of pain few can imagine. He traded his comfort for his freedom, choosing a barrel of vinegar over a German prisoner camp. The Colt 1911 was the final insurance policy that allowed Russell Dunham to return to his own lines. The Germans' failure to find the weapon during their search was their final and most fatal mistake. It allowed a single unarmed prisoner to turn the tables on 3 armed guards in a single moment. The heavy point for .5 caliber rounds ensured that when Dunham fired, the fight was over immediately. Frostbite is a silent killer that has claimed more soldiers in winter warfare than many realize. By the time Dunham reached the Ill River, his feet were on the verge of being lost to gangrene. The fact that he walked 30 miles on blackened toes is a feat of endurance that defies explanation. He was a man who had mastered his own pain, pushing it into a dark corner of his mind to survive. The Distinguished Service Cross is the second highest award, but his actions clearly demanded more. When the generals reviewed the tape of his actions, they realized he had done the work of a platoon. Upgrading the award to the Medal of Honor was a rare move that reflected the scale of his bravery. He joined the elite ranks of men like Audie Murphy, who also served in the 3rd Infantry Division. Ralph Dunham, Russell's brother, lived to see his sibling honored as one of the greatest heroes. The bond between brothers in combat is a theme that runs deep through the history of the war. They looked out for each other from the beaches of North Africa to the ruins of the German cities. Having his brother there in Nuremberg was likely the most important part of the ceremony for Russell. The town of Holzwehr eventually fell to the Americans, but at a cost that was hard to measure. It was the site where Audie Murphy performed his own legendary stand atop a burning tank destroyer. The 3rd Division was a breeding ground for legends, forged in the fire of the most intense combat. Dunham's story is a vital piece of that larger mosaic of heroism and sacrifice in the high mountains. After the war, Dunham didn't seek the spotlight or try to turn his fame into a career in politics. He chose a life of service, helping the next generation of veterans find their way home. He understood the trauma of war because he had lived through the very worst of it in the snow. He was a hero in the civilian world just as much as he had been a hero on Hill 600. The scar on his back was a lifelong reminder of the price he paid for the lives of his friends. He carried the weight of the medal around his neck with a humility that defined his entire character. He never forgot the men who didn't come home, the ones who remained in the soil of Alsace-Lorraine. To Russell, the medal belonged to all of them, and he was merely the one chosen to wear it. We must continue to tell these stories so that the names of men like Dunham do not fade into the mist. History is not just a list of dates and battles, but a collection of human choices made in the dark. Chose to stand up when everyone else was pinned down, and that made all the difference. He represents the best of us, the part of humanity that refuses to give in to fear or cold. The Ill River Bridge crossing was the final hurdle in a journey that had lasted for several days. Coming home to the sound of American voices must have been the greatest relief of his entire life. He had survived the machine guns, the grenades, the tanks, and the sauerkraut barrel of Holzwehr. He was a survivor in the truest sense of the word, a man who beat the odds at every single turn. The sulfa drugs and morphine of the 1940s were the cutting edge of medical technology at the time. They saved his life twice, once on the mountain and once after his daring escape from the chateau. Without the medics of the 3rd Division, the name Russell Dunham would be on a white cross today. We honor the healers just as we honor the fighters, for they are two sides of the same coin of war. Zeppelin Stadium in Nuremberg was a place once filled with the screams of Nazi propaganda. To have an American sergeant receive the Medal of Honor, there was a powerful symbol of victory. The darkness of the Third Reich was replaced by the light of a single man's extraordinary courage. It was the ultimate poetic justice for a soldier who had bled so much to see that day arrive. Today, Hill 616 is a quiet place where the trees grow tall and the snow falls in peace. There are no machine guns, no artillery, and no blood-stained mattress covers in the woods now. But if you listen closely to the wind, you might hear the ghost of a sergeant moving up the slope. His spirit remains a part of the landscape, a guardian of the mountain he conquered alone. The M1911 pistol remains an icon of American military power, a weapon that never let Dunham down. In the close quarters of the Kubelwagen, it was the only tool that could have secured his freedom. It is a simple design that works when it counts, much like the man who carried it under his jacket. 7 rounds of .45 caliber insurance were all he needed to change his fate and return to his unit. The Lucky Strike cigarettes that distracted the guards are a small, ironic detail in a story of war. A simple craving for a smoke allowed a Medal of Honor recipient to slip through the fingers of the enemy. It shows that even in the middle of a global conflict, the small things can have the biggest impact. The guards lost a prisoner in their lives, all for a pack of cigarettes they didn't even get to finish. Walking back to the company post with his stitches still in shows the depth of Dunham's loyalty. He didn't return for glory or for medals. He returned because his brother and his friends were still out there. The bond of the 2nd Squad was stronger than any medical order or any physical wound. He was a leader who led by example, showing his men that as long as he could stand, he would fight. The 3rd Infantry Division's 36 Medals of Honor is a record that stands to this very day. It speaks to the intensity of the combat they faced and the caliber of the men who filled their ranks. Dunham was a giant among giants, a soldier whose actions were so extreme they stood out even there. We celebrate the whole division through his story, honoring every man who wore the blue and white patch. The fermented smell of the sauerkraut stayed with Dunham for weeks after his escape. It was a scent he would never forget, a reminder of the 13 hours he spent hiding in the dark. It was a small price to pay for the chance to see his family again and live a long, full life. He turned a barrel of cabbage into a fortress of survival, a feat of quick thinking that saved him. The Alsatian campaign was one of the coldest winters in European history, a brutal trial for all. Frostbite and trench foot were just as dangerous as German snipers and hidden minefields. Dunham's survival in the sub-zero temperatures is as much a victory over nature as it was over the enemy. He was a man of iron, tempered in the freezing winds of the Vosges and the slush of the farmyards. When he finally passed away in 2009, the world lost one of its last links to that era of heroism. The greatest generation is moving into the pages of history, leaving us with their stories as guides. It is our duty to ensure that the forgotten stories are rescued and told with the respect they deserve. Russell Dunham is gone, but his medal and his memory remain as a challenge to all of us. What would you do if you were pinned in the snow with 1,200 rounds a minute flying overhead? Most would wait and pray, but Dunham chose to act, taking the weight of the battle on his own shoulders. He reminds us that we all have a Hill 616 in our lives, a challenge that seems too steep to climb. But if you have a plan, a mattress cover, and the will to keep moving, any peak can be conquered. The surgeons who saved his feet and his back are the unsung heroes of the Russell Dunham story. They worked in tents and basements, using primitive tools to keep the fighting men in the game. They saw the worst of humanity and did their best to put it back together with stitches and powder. We salute the battalion aid stations and the division clearing stations that made his return possible. The Seventh Army's push through France was a logistical and tactical marvel that broke the German line. Men like Dunham were the tip of the spear, the ones who had to do the dirty work of clearing the hills. Without the individual courage of the sergeant, the grand strategy of the generals would have failed. The war was won in the foxholes and the machine gun nests, 1 yard of snow-covered earth at a time. Dunham's life in Illinois was the perfect, happily ever after for a man who had seen so much death. He found peace in a quiet marriage and a steady job, stark contrast to the chaos of Hill 616. He lived long enough to see his grandchildren grow up in a world that his bravery helped to secure. He was the ultimate citizen soldier, a man who took up arms for a cause and then put them down. The 120 men of Company I who lived because of him went on to have their own lives and families. Thousands of children and grandchildren exist today because one man refused to die in the snow in 1945. The ripple effect of a single act of heroism is impossible to calculate, but beautiful to contemplate. One man's courage became the foundation for countless lives that would follow after the smoke cleared. Every time you see a Medal of Honor, remember the story of the mattress cover and the grenades. Remember the gash in the back and the kick that sent the egg grenade flying down the slope. Remember the sauerkraut barrel and the cigarettes and the walk across the bridge in the German jacket. These are the details that make a hero human, and the humans who become heroes are the best of us. We hope this story of Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham has inspired you and touched your heart. It is a story of a man who was given every reason to quit, but chose to keep crawling toward the top. He was a sergeant, a brother, a survivor, and a hero of the highest possible order in the United States. May his name always be spoken with respect, and his deeds always be remembered by the free world. The history of the 3rd Infantry Division is still being written by the soldiers who wear the patch today. They carry the legacy of Dunham into every conflict, knowing the standard of excellence he set. Nous resterons là, we shall remain there is their motto. And Dunham proved it true on Hill 616. He remained on that hill until every gun was silent and every one of his men was safe from the fire. The Vosges Mountains are beautiful today, a place of hikers and tourists and quiet snowy peaks. But beneath the surface of the quiet woods lies the memory of a battle that changed the world. Dunham's assault is taught in military schools as a master class in small unit tactics and individual valor. He did what a whole platoon could not, proving that quality of spirit is more important than quantity of men. As we close this chapter on Russell Dunham, we ask you to think about the sergeants in your own life. The people who do the hard work without asking for credit, the ones who protect us when the fire is hot. True heroism is often quiet, found in the counselor's office or the Veterans Benefit Center in St. Louis. Dunham was a hero for 9 years, not just for the 12 minutes he spent on top of that hill. Thank you for joining us in the archives today to rescue this forgotten story of American courage. We are dedicated to bringing these accounts to light, ensuring the greatest generation lives on forever. Russell Dunham may be gone, but as long as we tell his story, he will never truly be forgotten by history. He was the man in the white robe, the sergeant of Hill 616, and a true American legend of the snow. Hit that like button one more time to honor the memory of Russell Dunham and his brothers in arms. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story of real-life heroism from the front lines of the past. Drop a final comment and let us know what other forgotten heroes you want to see us cover next. Till next time, keep your head down, your heart strong, and never stop moving toward the summit.